Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Robert Kiltzik's 1983 slasher film, Sleepaway Camp. I am getting over being sick, so I'm probably going to sound somewhat disgusting in this video. I apologize in advance, but there you go. So, Sleepaway Camp. We start out at a camp. Yay! We have this sort of water skiing sequence in which a dad and two kids, Peter and Angela, are basically hit by a motorboat. The dad is killed. One of the kids is killed. Peter, we assume is killed, because the next scene we have is like 5 years later or something like that. Angela is going with her cousin Ricky. They're going to leave their mom's house. Ricky's mom, technically Angela's aunt, who appears to be a psychopath. And the reason she appears to be a psychopath is because she's the only one in the movie who has stylized acting. Everyone else is very naturalistic. They just perform the way that human beings normally interact with one another. Or rather the way that kids normally interacted with each other in the early 80s, which means they're basically dicks to each other for the most part. But Ricky's mom, yeah, she's very odd. She is the character that you would expect to be the murderer in this film. Just based on her performance. It's this very detached, robotic type performance. With this continual seconding of everything she says. So it'll be like, well, Ricky, we wouldn't want you to be late. No, we certainly wouldn't want that. She does that continually. It's very, very odd. And that's an important detail. File that away in the back of your mind till we get to the end of the movie. So, Ricky and Angela go to this camp, the one right across the lake from where her dad died. Angela is very quiet. The first entire portion of the movie, she says nothing. She just stares at people. Big eyes. I can't even get my eyes nearly as big as Felicia Rose does. This was her first role. Those of you who are horror fans may know her work. But she just sits, she stares at people, she does not participate in the life of the camp, etc., etc. People are bullying her. Ricky is sticking up for her. Eventually, Ricky's friend... Oh, and also as people are sort of bullying her, some crazy, horrific stuff starts to happen. Like the cook, who's a pedophile, and apparently that's just known around the camp, and they're just like, whatevs. Guess we'll let him around a bunch of kids. He attempts to rape Angela in the walk-in. Ricky stops him, and the kids run off. And everybody is just sort of like, well, I guess that's fine. But then he is pouring salt into a giant pot of boiling water, and someone comes in and knocks him over. The pot topples over on top of him, and he is scalded severely. So that's the kind of crazy shit that starts happening. People getting killed accidentally. I guess we're supposed to think that it's Ricky, because that's what Mel, the camp owner, seems to think. He really convinces himself that Ricky is doing all of this. I never really thought it was Ricky, to be honest. I always thought it was Angela. If you're sitting there just staring silently at people while they talk to you, yeah, that's some suspicious behavior. So I don't know if, I mean, I feel like Ricky is a somewhat clumsily done red herring in the film. But stuff goes on. More and more people pick on Angela because they're kids in the 80s. That's what they do. More and more people get killed. The camp is increasingly in trouble as parents are like, I don't really want my kids going to murder camp anymore, so I'm going to come get them. So, a whole bunch of people die, go on and on and on. And eventually, at the end of the film, Mel beats Ricky almost to death, thinking he's the murderer. And then we find out that Ricky is not the murderer because it was actually Angela. But there's a big twist. Spoilers coming up. Angela is sort of not Angela. So what we find out is that in the boat accident at the beginning, it was actually not Angela who died, or it was actually not Peter who died, it was Angela. Peter survived, and he gets sent to live with Ricky and his mom, but Ricky's mom already has a son, Ricky. And so she decides that she wants a daughter. So she raises Peter as Angela. And at the end of the film, the last thing that we get, Angela had this kind of relationship with Ricky's best friend. And he had tried to take her shirt off and stuff like this while they were kissing. And she was not having it. At the end of the movie, she invites him to go skinny dipping. And then she cuts his head off and is just like stroking his head in her lap. These two counselors come upon them on the shore of the lake. Angela's just sitting there stroking this kid's head, his body right there, so we can't initially tell that she has decapitated him. But then she stands up, turns around with this kid's head, just completely naked, penis visible, covered in blood, and makes this just weird, creepy, hissing sound. Felicia Rose, who, as far as I know, doesn't actually have a penis, so I'm thinking that was all CGI'd, is what you do. But Felicia Rose goes back to that wide-eyed, crazy stare. Sorry. Just mouth completely open. And we get this, like, type sound. It's weird. It's a weird ending. So, the big question. The big question from the perspective of 2023, I think looking back on this 40 years later, is this a transphobic film? I don't know, honestly. It's, I think, an extremely difficult question to parse in this instance, in part because it depends on whether or not we think that Angela is trans. And that might at first seem like a dumb thing to be uncertain about, but actually I'm going to argue that it's not. So I'm of three minds on this. I see three potential readings, and I don't know that one of them is necessarily right to the exclusion of the others. So the first, I would say, is the sort of 1983 reading, the sort of basic, old school horror, anti-LGBT type reading, which is that Angela is psychotic and a murderer because she is trans. So that being trans, having gender dysphoria, whatever it is, that is associated with mental illness and therefore with being a murderer. We might see a more straightforward example of this, with somebody like Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. Right? In this film, his serial killing of women is linked to his gender identity confusion. And it's very directly linked in the film. Like they have the psychologist, Hannibal Lecter, make that connection for us. So it's not incidental. Here it's not explicitly spelled out in that way. Angela is a murderer because she is trans. But the fact that they added a flashback sequence in which her dad was with his lover suggests there's some sort of linkage between being LGBT and insanity. Now, today, we know that that's complete nonsense. We know there is no actual link between being LGBT and violent behavior. And we even know that suicide rates among LGBT people are less a product of being LGBT as such and more a product of social discrimination. Because in places with greater rates of acceptance and support for LGBT people, suicide rates are measurably lower than in places with lower levels of tolerance and support. So, the link between being LGBT and mental instability, not particularly well founded. So, but in 83, people probably thought that, generally speaking. There was much more anti-LGBT prejudice, and the sexually deviant, gender identity deviant, whatever it is, villain in movies was very, very common trope. So that's the one reading. The second reading, I would say, is that Angela is not trans, in the sense that Angela has been forced to be Angela against her will. It's not a question of Peter recognized about himself that he was, in fact, female. It's that Peter has been the victim of child abuse. I find this actually a much more compelling reading of it because forcing a child to behave according to gender norms that are not that don't align with their identity, I would say is a form of child abuse. Now, I'm going to qualify that statement by saying that the gender that child identifies with, not the gender that a parent or guardian imposes on them. That's the thing here. If a child identifies as a gender other than what they were assigned at birth, then to me it is abusive to force them to be the gender that they were assigned at birth, regardless of that. That's my position here. This is the opposite kind of scenario where a child, Peter, who presumably identified as a boy while he was Peter, is now being forced to act as a girl. He's being forced into an identity he does not identify with. And presumably there's some manner of coercion and possibly even punishment for not complying with that. So I think there's a better reading of this, that Peter is not, that Angela/Peter is not trans. They're a victim of child abuse. And child abuse, as we know, does have a much higher likelihood of manifesting in further abuse later in that person's life. Not necessarily murder, although that's not out of the realm of possibility. But people who have experienced abuse, particularly as children, are more likely to abuse partners, more likely to abuse their children, etc., than people who have not experienced that kind of abuse. So we've got those two potential readings. Either Angela is a murderer because she is trans, or Angela is not trans, she's a victim of child abuse. But I would actually maybe argue for the third possibility, which is actually Angela is trans, but not in the way that the simplistic 1980s reading would have it. Angela is trans paradoxically because she is Angela. So the false identity is Angela. In this sense, Peter is this character's real identity, who they truly are. But Peter has been forced to live as Angela, and in that sense is ironically trans. The interior life of this person does not match the socially, externally coerced external person. And so this is a weird sort of double bluff type thing, where the truth of this person's identity actually, ironically enough, does align with their physical body, with their genitalia, presumably their chromosomes, though we don't obviously know, as we haven't tested Peter's chromosomes, Angela's chromosomes, whatever it is. But Peter, the boy, the true person, has been forced to live in as a gender that they do not identify with. And in that sense, they are trans. They just haven't come out. They are closeted. They are a closeted trans character. In that they have been forced against their will and against their natural inclination to be a gender that they do not identify with. And that's the experience of many trans people prior to coming out, and even sometimes after coming out in certain circumstances. Because often, as with being gay, as with being lesbian, as with being bisexual, many trans people are not out in all circumstances. And so there is that need to police one's behavior in order to hide who you really are. And that's a remarkably difficult and painful experience, according to many trans people, as well as according to many other LGBT people and other people in the queer community, that need to constantly watch your behavior and monitor yourself and police yourself so that you don't give away something to someone who either would not be accepting, or who does not know, who you're not comfortable having them know that about your identity. That constant need for self-monitoring takes a remarkable psychological toll on people. Typically not leading to murder, but it's often very painful and leads to diminished feelings of self-esteem, self-respect, things like this. So I think that's the most interesting of these potential readings, that Angela is actually trans because she's been forced to live as Angela despite genuinely being Peter.